Good morning, selamat pagi semuanya. How are you today? Everyone is fine? Actually, I'm supposed to ask, are you okay? Because this is Are You Okay Day. And just in case you're wondering why Huimin and I have yellows on us, it's because Are You Okay Day. We're both mental health first aider, that's why. It's a special day for Miss really, because we have quite a number of items to go through. So, as usual, refreshment, of course, snack Indonesia, seperti biasanya. And then, in addition to the seminar, we will also have book preview and book launch towards the end of it. So after the seminar, we will have a book preview and book launch. So Paul Thomas's book preview and Pak Stuart Robson, where are you, Pak Robson? Oh, okay. Pak Robson's book launch, and Bu Barbara Hadley will guide us through that. And then we'll have book sales, and we have our colleagues there at the back. Ibu Linda from Indah Creations and Publications, the publisher for Pak Robson's book, and one table. And next to that is our dear colleague from Monash Press, Duncan, will be sitting there providing some sales for Paul Thomas's book as well. But before we go through that, as usual, I can't show off enough of our collection here at the library. So to the right of me, or to the right of Ariel Herianto, we have displayed some books from our collection, just some examples. Of course, we have heap others in our collection that is on the topic that Paul Thomas is going to present today. In fact, Pak Thomas have been using those resources as well in his research. And next to that are samples of Pak Robson's book and as well as Pak Thomas's book. So help yourself with food, help yourself with having a look at the books later after the seminar, and enjoy your time. I shall now hand it over to Pak Ariel, the guide through.
Thank you. Let me begin by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we are gathered today. I wish to pay my respect to the elders past and present. Today, as Ibu Anita Dewi said, this is a very special event, partly because of the launch, but also because we have a very special guest today, Bapak Richard Matthew, the Consul General of Australia from Makassar. Could you please stand up, Richard, and say a few words maybe to us?
Thanks, Pat Ariel. Thanks, Paul. Yes, I'm the Australian Consul General in Makassar. We established the Consulate General in Makassar 3.5 years ago, and it's now one of 3 Consulate Generals in Indonesia. There's the embassy, of course, that huge big red building in Kuningan, and then there's a Consulate General in Bali, which has been there for a long time, ours in Makassar, and one in Surabaya, which opened up about 1.5 years ago. Now, this is all part of Australia expanding its diplomatic footprint across Indonesia and a commitment to expanding the bilateral relationship. But I'm very fortunate to have opened up our Consulate General in Makassar. Makassar is a very special place. It's very different to Java. I mean, eastern Indonesia, as you probably know, is very different to Java, very different to Sumatra, very different to Bali, very special. Sulawesi itself is a very special place. We cover the 11 provinces of eastern Indonesia, not including Papua, but including West Papua, Maluku, North Maluku, the 6 provinces of Sulawesi, and we also have consular jurisdiction over East Kalimantan and South Kalimantan. But I'm especially happy to be in Makassar because that's a very historic place in the bilateral relationship. And I think, Paul, you were saying that you've had a bit to do with Makassar through your historical research in the past. Makassar was actually, as you might know, the place where Indonesians first travelled from to Australia in the 18th century. Thousands of Makassan sailors would sail from Makassar to the northern coast of Australia from about the middle of the 18th century through to the beginning of the 20th century. in search of tripang, sea cucumber, and other goodies which they would then take back with them to Makassar and then sell to Chinese traders who supplied Imperial China with sea cucumber, that was the main commodity, sea cucumber, because it had special properties for men and was a particularly valuable commodity in China. But this trade went on for 160 years or so, until it was stopped by the South Australian government, which had sovereignty over Northern Australia at the time. But there's more to it than that. At the end of the Second World War, the Australian Army occupied and administered Makassar for over 100 days. It was part of the retaking of eastern Indonesia by the Allied forces. Australia was given the task by General McCarthy to retake eastern Indonesia. Major battles occurred in Balikpapan, or near Balikpapan, Sandakan. But Makassar they walked into and had quite a peaceful occupation. But they were there for 3 months or so. But most of them were young men who'd been fighting for many years and wanted to get home. So they only stayed a little while. And then they handed it back to the authorities of the time, which was Nika, the Dutch Indonesian army. But the Australian presence was there. There's not much left, but it's an interesting phase in Australian history. There's some really good photographs from that period in the War Memorial, and some people have been looking at that in the past, and maybe Professor Robson studied that, I'm not sure, but it's a fascinating part of Australian history and something that I'm pleased to be able to delve into now and again, amongst all the other things that we do. But we're certainly very keen to promote more research into the region, and Monash is one of the most active universities in eastern Indonesia, in Makassar especially. Monash has a special relationship with Hasanuddin University in Makassar, and so I'm very pleased to be able to come along and attend your seminar today, Pak Ariel. I'm afraid I have to go at 12 o'clock because I've got to head off, but I'm really looking forward to hearing the proceedings today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We are so privileged because the short time that Pak Richard had here, and yet he decided to visit us here out of the other universities currently. So thank you so much, Pak Richard. Because of the other events following this, you will notice also our seminar time will be a bit shorter than usual. Without further ado, I'd like now to turn to Paul, who is now a lecturer in Deakin University, but also still associated with us. Thank you so much, Paul.
I think this microphone should be good enough for you. So can everyone hear me? Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Okay. Well, I've got to get on with it. It's going to be a bit like Shakespeare in 5 minutes, the entire works, because really I'm dealing with the entire life of a man. In spite of it being short, it was a very eventful one. It shouldn't have been. It should have been a fairly tranquil one for Samuel Jacob. He lived in eastern Indonesia. In particular, he's commonly identified as an Ambonese, but he lived the most important part of his life in Indonesia in Dobbo, which is on the Aru Islands, and I'll show you maps here shortly. When I say he should have lived a quiet life, he was very dedicated to education. He was a school principal. His interest in education was his top priority, and he forewent many other offers to work more closely with the Dutch administration in order to continue his interest in education. But things go totally topsy-turvy with the outbreak of the war, and he's thrust into positions he never dreamt he would be in. Can we, next slide? Yep, I've got to get used to this giving instructions. So this is the eastern part of the archipelago. You can see the bird of paradise head of New Guinea just poking up from the right-hand side. We've got Ambon, which indeed where he was born. But when I'm talking about the Aru Islands, they're here. It almost looks like one solid island here, but it's actually a collection of islands with all sorts of estuaries and swamps in between. And Dobbo's over on this side. It is an area which Australians have had a long connection with as well. First of all, as Pak Matthew was mentioning, coming down from Sulawesi, this was part of the Malay Road. They're concern was to follow coastlines and where they could pick up supplies and do trading, and so many of those vessels coming in for the Trepang trade would stop in Dobbo. And then further on in the 19th century, we had Australian pearlers head over to Dobbo as well and set up shop there, and there were also pearls coming from the Aru Islands into the pearling industry in northern Australia. The areas of interest that I have, are fairly broad. This is a new piece of research for me in some ways. I had picked up Samuel Jacobs some time ago, but then I put him aside, and we'll come to that in a moment. But my main interest was really looking at the history of translators, interpreters, and this has taken me into war history, and I'm a little bit, feel like a little bit of an intruder because I see the war historian as a particular type of person, and it's almost an industry rather than an academic field, the amount of books and films and documentaries that come out. And I also had to deal with a lot more material than I'd ever dealt with before because so much is available when you get into these war histories. They documented so much. It's also related to a general development in understanding Australian Indonesian history. Around the 1970s and early 1980s, histories of Australian Chinese and then Australian Japanese started to develop, and the history that we share between Indonesia and Australia has taken a while to get going, but you can see in the last 10 years there's been quite a number of publications, and this is just books in the last 10 years. Of course, there's been countless journal articles as well. There's been lots of motivators for this historical engagement, and these are just a few. I won't go into them, but they are interrelated, and when we talk about certain areas of this history, you often find it's difficult to really pin down the primary motivator. Samuel Jacob has been written about before. He was investigated by a historian called Sean Brawley, whose main interest was really in his wife Annie and her battle in the High Courts of Australia to stay or to remain in Australia after the Second World War, because the government had decided that all the Indonesians in Australia would need to return. But this is a spoiler alert. Unfortunately, Jacob dies during the war, and she's left a widow in Australia, and so she decides it could be too dangerous for her to return. So he does talk about Jacob, and particularly in the article "The Spirit of Barrington House," which was the civil service school for the Dutch in Australia during the war. And but he doesn't go much into Dutch records. He talks about some moments in his life, but they're not in any detail whatsoever. As I said before, my research was related originally, when it's as far as being connected to Samuel Jacobs, the research was related to a series of interpreters and translators I wanted to look at, which gave us some insight into particular moments in historical engagement. I'm sorry. Oh. Yeah. And you can go to the next slide. That's those texts. Sorry, I'm looking at this thing in front of me. I'm used to, and keep going. We'll keep moving. Okay, so there's those articles that I mentioned by Sean Brawley, and they've been the two key articles which have mentioned Jacob and his family. So next slide. Now, when we're looking at, so I originally came to Jacobs in connection with these other interpreters and translators, which were supposed to investigate particular moments of Australian-Indonesian history engagement, and in the end, I dropped him because I decided to gather these three in particular, so that I could focus on the Trepang industry that took place from the mid-17th century through to the early 20th century. You'll notice also all the names: Abraham, Williams, John O'Dean, Tingada Hans and Samuel Jacobs. I don't do this intentionally. I don't look for Indonesians with sort of very European names. It's just so happened that they've all come up in that way. When I've talked about it before, some people haven't realised that these were all Indonesians that I was talking about or researching. Next slide. No. So the means in which I expand the work that Sean Brawley has already done has been mainly to take up searches within the National Archives in The Hague, the Netherlands National Archives, and continue to use National Archives in Australia. I was lucky enough, I don't speak Dutch, but I was able to use the archives and find some very, very key reports which are the basis for a lot of this research. And perhaps one of the most outstanding examples was a report by Jacobs himself, which describes an incident we'll come to about an uprising that happened in Dobbo. And so a lot of the facts come from that report, which was very detailed, but also we get an understanding of the way he was approaching the situation. There's also the papers related to the High Court case with Annie, his wife, which also describes some of Jacob's tasks while he was in Melbourne and why she felt he was a hero. So the languages of the research include Indonesian, English, Dutch, Japanese, and I have to say that I haven't touched the Japanese side of it at all. As I explained, I don't speak Dutch. One of the things I wanted to do originally was to work on a postgraduate course which would help students not avoid languages they don't speak when they're doing their research, because it's not a particularly good methodology to ignore a body of work, and we have to find ways around that so that we can still include it. So I won't go into the details, but I was trying to develop a methodology myself of how I might go about it, and there were some things here that you can see. I have to go through various stages to use those documents. Sure, it would be great if I had a Dutch research assistant, and maybe one day I will, but at this stage I mainly identify key documents and I work through this procedure. Next slide. So defence brings us into an intense concentration of communication resources, a requirement for information. So it pushes, in the Second World War, this pushes contact between Indonesians and Australians to a level which it had never been before. There is a need, of course, for interpreters and translators, but people who can analyse, do a first analysis of the information that's coming in these different languages. And there's also the activity of propaganda, which is quite critical in the war. And there's the need to address that propaganda directly to the people that Australian troops and Allied troops would have contact with. And that meant pamphleting Eastern Indonesia quite a good deal. I haven't got time, unfortunately, to go into some of this, but there was also quite a language question when these pamphlets were started to develop. There was confusion between Malay and Indonesian, and you get some discussion by the Indonesians saying, look, we've got to tell them that Indonesian language is different from Malay, and we think it's different, but there's an uncertainty whether it is that different. They just know that the pamphlets are not reading quite so well, and that they have to address it to the audience that it's going to be given to. There were other areas which I haven't got time to go into of contact related to defence. We talked about Trepang, those early, what the colonists of New South Wales may have called trading posts, but what the British referred to as forts, meant that there was some degree of intelligence gathering. In fact, the Dutch had asked some of the captains of the praus doing the Trepang trade to report back exactly what the British were up to in Northern Australia. In the First World War, we also, the armed forces employed a small number of Indonesians to go into the Netherlands, East Indies, to report on German movements through the East Indies. The East Indies were neutral at that stage, so the Australian armed forces were very restricted as to what they could do, and they did send patrols there, and of course eventually we take German New Guinea during that war. One of the interpreters was given Australian residency after the war as part of his service, as a reward for his service, which is quite interesting when it comes to us discussing Annie's predicament after the Second World War. So let's go on to the details of Samuel Jacobs' biography. As I said, he's considered Ambonese. He's described as that as part of his sort of ethnic identity, and partly that's because he's born in Ambon, or in a small town, Haria, Saparua and Ambon. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. He's the son of Latsa Jacob. Now, Latsa Jacob is described in all sorts of ways as a Pati or Orang Kaya, Bupati, different records, just depends which ones you see, but we would put him in the Bupati or regent class. He owns considerable amount of land on Aru, in the Aru Islands, and has a good deal of business in agriculture. So they're fairly wealthy off. This is a wealthy family in eastern Indonesia. And it means that, that Samuel has access to schools which he may not have had. So he attends a school in Ambon, and next slide. And he winds up at the Quake School, in Ambon, which is for training teachers. And that's his ultimate ambition, that he will become a teacher in the schools, and he's focused on Eastern Indonesia. The education tradition in Eastern Indonesia was very early to develop. It was part of the deals between the Dutch and the local rulers that they would provide education. And it started in Malay, and then it went into Dutch. While he's studying, he marries Annie, who is from he was Methodist from Manado in North Sulawesi. Got that good. And they're going to have they'll have 8 children. Annie will actually have 9 children, but that's the story that we have to get to as well. It's a big family, and he's going to. This is going to cause him some problems, and decisions he makes will be based a lot on how he protects his family. Here we can see a series, his background in terms of education, and you can see that he moves around. It's not in one place. He goes to different islands around the area. If we move to the next slide, there's a map here, and so those are those schools that he was teaching in. So he's a Dutch language teacher, and very quickly he becomes a principal in the schools. Now, that map's quite interesting because really it reflects a lot of his life. This is related to where his mother was from, and this is where he was born, and this is where his father was from, well, was based in Aru Islands. But it's also interesting, of course, later on for the Allied forces. This is their main area of operations, the main area that the Australians and the Dutch will cooperate in. Matthew mentioned that the Australian troops had gone into Makassar, but this was an area of intense interest to the Allied forces, meaning the Dutch and the Australian forces. And he has these contacts, both family and professional, across this archipelago, which is part of his value to them, his knowledge, his geographical knowledge, but also his contacts. Next slide. So we can see part of his commitment to this education. He is offered to be Bupati in Maipor, in the Aru Islands, and he rejects it. He first rejects it in 1928, and then he rejects it again in 1931. And this is a quote which the family had various different versions of, but this is the quote that they call his motto from Penyulu, which we've got over there, the magazine that was brought out by the Dutch Information Centre. And you can see that his emphasis here really is on educating the people. That's what he wants to do. And he doesn't want to be involved in all this politics, and he sees that as a complication. Next slide. Oh, you're going to hear my bad Dutch pronunciation now, but anyway, the Helgesstedel, Healthier scale? Oh, come on. Stuart, help me out here.
The lake is still there.
That's it. That's exactly what I was saying. Right. Here he's offered this to be, you know, an equal to a European in the courts of the Netherlands East Indies, but he rejects that as well. He doesn't have a strong association with the Dutch, but he has a great admiration for them, and this is a sort of conflict that is threaded through his life. Next slide. Yeah. So he arrives in Dobbo in the late 1930s, and he becomes principal of the government native school at Dobbo in 1941. This is a very small place. Dobbo is only got about 15,000 people in 1942. It's got 14 languages. When I say 15,000, they're not all in the town. This is sort of scattered around as well. So we're talking about a very quiet spot. The majority, or a large percentage of the population in Aro at the time are Ambonese. But there's a great mixture there. There's Timorese there are people from, there are Bugis there. So it's a very mixed community because it's a trading community. But there's and the majority of the population is Christian, with only a small percentage being Muslim. I will just skip over this. This is a map of Dobbo, which was put together during the war to mark out the most important areas. In spite of it being this very quiet spot, small port, they have this, they have this school, they have libraries, they are very keen in terms of education. So to some degree, Samuel Jacob is in his element. He's there teaching the people that he wants to teach. Next slide. There's no grand buildings in Dobbo, no grand Dutch colonial palaces. They're just simple buildings which the Dutch have a small presence there. Next slide. How am I going for time?
Well, we have about 9 minutes left.
Right, okay, good.
No, for the question and answer.
Oh, good. Oh, right. Well, this is a pivotal moment in Samuel's or in Jacob's life. Is what's called the Kaumera Uprising. It will be the very reason that he's awarded, he's made a hero or war hero, but it's a period of great conflict in the community. The reasons for, now the idea of calling it Kaumera, the Red Uprising, suggests communism, but when you look at it, there's not a lot of communism happening there. Most of the time it's about really the issue of rations during the war. So we can go next slide. In fact, Samuel's crystallises the problems down to these points. Basically, an inequity in the dishing out of the rations at the time. Remember, this is not a rich agricultural area around Dobbo. There's mainly swamps. They relied on trade, and so during the war they're being cut off, and so they don't have a lot of basics. And the people are complaining that they can't even look after their families. Their families are getting sick. They don't have enough rice, and yet they see Dutchmen within the community or privileged people getting a much larger part of the rations. They also then start restricting rations to only those people who paid tax. So this creates even more unrest. And there was also this clerk who was somewhat undiplomatic. He used to tell them to makan batu saja, to eat rocks, just to go and eat rocks, which didn't help the situation either. And then we had the case of 200 to 300 Javanese evacuees. Just go to the next slide. From New Guinea. They were from a place called Babbo, where the Dutch were establishing an airfield and was being bombed heavily by the Japanese. So they'd been moved into Dobbo. And here are these 200 to 300 strangers, which they have, in a small community, in a small community, and it causes unrest. The Javanese are accused of breaking in at night to the villagers' homes. They play dice in the middle of the day, which Jacob says this is a practice we never did it, let alone in the middle of the day. It just been just about had disappeared in Dobbo. So the Javanese are seen as sort of morally corrupt. And then there's also the identity of the fact that they are Muslims in a mainly Christian community. But when you read through these other problems of really the morality or the ethnic identity or the religion, I mean, it comes down to a group of strangers being in a very small community at a time where they're under immense stress. So it has to cover all those elements. Just go to the next slide and skip over the next one. I'll just go to the... And so what happens is that this group of Javanese teams up with some disgruntled locals within Dobbo, people who felt that they weren't getting enough rations, and they actually form the Perserikatan Rakyat Indonesia, roughly translated in Indonesian People's Union, to give it this political manifesto, and they talk about what they want to do for the community, about bringing independence, but they also put together an agenda of how they're going to take over the town, which is basically to imprison the Europeans, hand them over to the Japanese, take control of administration and collect the guns. Next slide. Now I'm just going to jump over that one, keep going. And so what happens is, after about 2 days of the uprising, the people understand that they're a somewhat disorganised group, they're not going to get any more rations, and they become suspicious, and that, there are selintingan, rumours that they're going to burn the churches down. And so local opposition builds up, led by some of the Timorese and other Christians within the group, to arrest all the Kaum Merah group. So they put them in jail, and the fact that they could do it relatively easy shows you that they were a somewhat disorganised group anyway. But within another couple of days, the people from Dobbo, I think it's an important point, is they approach the police officer and say, you have to release the Dobbo people. You can only arrest the Javanese, you can't arrest the Dobbo people. And these people were, many of the Dobbo people they're talking about are Muslims, so you can get the idea that community identity superseded religious identity. So the police officer agrees, he's going to release the Dobbo people, and so they come out, but they say, well, we're not going to leave unless you release the rest of them. And so he gets caught in this tangle between the crowd, and he releases all the prisoners. And this becomes quite controversial when the Dutch return and ask, well, what did you do with the rebels? And they said, oh, we let them go. And Jacob himself is blamed for not taking action in this case. I showed you some of the weaponry, the traditional weapons, etc. As the school principal, he was supposed to stand there and stop the uprising, which I thought was a big ask anyway. Just go to the next slide. What happens is the family decide to escape. You're going to tell me I only got 2 minutes, aren't you?
No, not you. It's in Tasmania.
Right. Well, this is, I think, the details of this. Hopefully you'll be able to read later on, but the details are that the family are interned by the Japanese when they arrive. What the Dutch do in response, by the way, to the rebellion is they send troops. And Dobbo before that was not really on the radar of the Japanese. But when the Dutch troop arrives, they brought over by an Australian naval vessel, the Japanese immediately respond. And so Jacob and his family are all interned in Dobbo, but they stay there only for 2 days, and then the whole family escapes. They take off into the mangroves, into the jungle, and they travel down from Dobbo all the way down to Michael, where his father had been the Bupati, and they stay there for a month. And then they find troops, Dutch troops, which had escaped, join with them, and end up in Nijboer. And it's there that they're picked up by the HMAS Warrnambool and taken to Darwin. Next slide. So we've got Jacob's family. They arrive in Adelaide with no clothes, really. Many of them were sick from malaria. And remember, he takes 7 of his children through the jungle and the swamps and gets them to Darwin. It's not an evacuation exactly until they get to the Australian naval vessel. And they're offered clothes in Adelaide and proceed to Melbourne. Next slide. Right. How much time can you give me? 2 minutes?
Well, ask Ivani to Devi. Can we go on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I'll at least get to the social networks and what happens in Melbourne because it's quite critical. So he arrives in Melbourne and here is this person we've already seen the map of who has this network of association through the very area that Australian troops are planning and Dutch troops are planning to take the Japanese on, and it's their area of operation. You have someone who speaks Malay fluently, Dutch fluently, and several of the local languages fluently. So it's not too much of a hard guess to where he's going to end up. And that's with intelligence, but also working in propaganda. He's moved into the Metropole Hotel where many Indonesians stayed at the time, often called Rumah Indonesia. And then he moves into a flat in Bond Beach. Which I had to look that up just the same as I looked up all those small Aru Islands towns. He joins quite a large Indonesian community in Melbourne, but a very diverse group of people. And Australians were just getting used to it. For Australians, most of the time, if you talked about Malays, they were the pearlers, they were simple fishermen, and here they met suddenly a group of, the pearlers had come down into Melbourne as well. They had educated Indonesians. They had a broad spectrum to experience of the Indonesian community like they had never experienced before. Figures vary, 5,000, 10,000, we're not quite sure. Just skip over the next slide. Right, go to activities. Keep going. Next slide. Next slide. Right, so the first job he takes up is working on Penyuluh, and he takes that up as both a translator and he writes articles for it, and so that's where a lot of our understanding of Jacob comes from, or part of our understanding comes from. He's trained at the Civil Administration School, which is based in Kew. They also trained Australians there. Not long after he starts, they decide to expand the Malay language program at the school, and he is taken on as a tutor as well to teach there. And he's teaching both Australians and Dutch during that time. Next slide. So this was quite interesting. It was established based on a program which had already been running at Leiden University. They were considered part of a neo-ethical school which saw Indonesia becoming independent, but within a commonwealth of the Dutch, and still under the Dutch crown. And so he's quite influenced by his experience there. He's treated well, but there is an intake of 30 students, but only about 9 are Indonesian and only 2 are non-Javanese, which is really quite limiting given the ambition of the place. Next slide. I think unfortunately they didn't include the names here, but I suspect that this is Samuel Jacob here. So this was quite an operation. The paper came out, it appeared in 2 forms, one at different times, one as a magazine and the second time as a newspaper. So I've used the resources here to access the magazine form of it. The newspaper form, a full collection is available at the Victoria State Library, but it's in very poor condition and we very much need to digitise it to save that history. It's literally falling apart at the moment. This is obviously they've got someone who is able to process information, who's able to translate Dutch, but also initiate some information on his own. Next slide. So here is an idea of who are the people he's being connected to and how he gets this influence. Most important is Van der Plas. He's one of the leading Netherlands East Indies administrators, and he's the one who decides that he should go to that Jacob should go to the Dutch civil school, civil servant school. He's also got other interesting characters, some very well known like Julius Dahija, and also Peter Kalalo is an interesting character. I've just been trying to find out more information about him. He arrives in Australia in the 1930s as a storekeeper for the Australia-Java shipping line. He marries an Australian at the time, and when he retires at the age of 40, just before the war, he's described as one of those rare people that we used to see a lot of. That is the the Dutch, Nordic Dutch, which take up a house on the coast of Australia. I can't see him as particularly Nordic or Dutch, but there you go. I did look up his immigration, and they're very clear. They just call him Malay. So his Nordic features were lost on them, but he still, maybe it was a way that he stayed in Australia, given the white Australia. If we move to the next slide, and this is where I'll finish up. I'll try and finish up just this, and one or two slides afterwards is just so it comes together that his experience in Dobbo and his part in, it's usually described as quelling the uprising, but what his role in Dobbo about that Kaum Merah uprising is that he's almost arrested by the group himself. They threaten his life, but people rally around him and get him free. He then stands off, and this is why he's being criticised by some of the Dutch military. But he stands back and eventually forms a committee. And it's really his administrative ability that he's getting the medal for, rather than some prowess on the field of war. He is able to take members of this very disparate community, he brings them together in a committee, and they organise themselves, because at first they're cut off from the Dutch, and then when the Dutch do arrive and give orders to rearrest the Kaum Merah, he does cooperate with the Dutch. So he gets this medal. Here we go. The Kros van Verdienste. That's it. That's it again. Fantastic. I will take a pronunciation class. So, as I said, not everyone agrees. And in particular, there's this Sergeant Major Smith who is really annoyed. He goes to a major function at the Metropole Hotel. Here's a speech by Jacob talking about how his role in the suppression of the rebellion or the uprising. He then sees a newspaper article, and he can't hold himself back and writes a report to the Dutch saying, look, he's not the person who really is behind all of this. And he was complicit in the release of some of the prisoners as well. But this is taken into account. This has already been taken into account, and it's really a misunderstanding of what this award was for. It was created in the 1940s in London by the Dutch in exile in 1941. By the Dutch in exile, they wanted to reward civil servants, people who for great heroism. Okay. We're up to his death. We're up to his death. So here I really will finish, because Jacob's death occurs in 1944 on a mission to Merauke. He is involved in a crash with a Dakota DC-3, which is carrying 20 people. All people die, and they never recover the bodies. So most of the reports, I haven't seen any report talking about the rediscovery of the wreckage of the plane. So most of those articles must have been either missed it or didn't published. I know they were published after. I don't know why they didn't mention it, but it was rediscovered in 1989, and his remains were interned in 1989, in July 1989, in the Cairns War Cemetery. and they had a memorial service in 2004. I have to finish up now, but look, I think a biography is a very personal way of experiencing this kind of history. We're getting a greater awareness of the history that Indonesians were in Australia during the Second World War and the greater picture, but we don't have a lot of details about the actual personal hardships that individuals suffered and the heroism that people were performed. The idea that that Jacob is a hero comes across because of the medal, because of the family, but it's a problematic one because he's not in the military. It's also his nationality is not quite clear because Indonesia as an independent state doesn't exist yet. It appears that he's being rewarded by the Dutch, but he's quite loyal to what he calls his country. And so I don't think he would want to be seen as a Dutch war hero. He would want to be seen as an Indonesian war hero. But at the same time, he was working so close with the Allies, he's not really recognised by the Australians because he's seen as a member of the Dutch civil service. I'm going to open it for questions. There's still lots of questions for me. I'm still going through an immense amount of material, which I've had in the last, really only had a chance to look at in the last 3 months, but it's slow going. Do we have time for questions?
Yes.
We do? Fantastic. Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I could keep going.
You could say a few words if you like to.
I would only say that I'm not quite sure whether I'm writing a history or a film script with this particular history. I mean, the elements there are quite amazing. Really, that someone would take their family, escape themselves from Japanese intern camp, move across swamps and jungles with 7 children, and find himself in Australia working with the Allies, going on missions, which I didn't get a chance to talk about. He went on missions with Australians and Indonesians into eastern Indonesia, where he was the main communicator, where he was the one who explained exactly what the Allies were up to and why they should support the Allies and why the cause was so important. So he was considered a good communicator, and the others within the expedition couldn't undertake that role. The bright ending, I guess, is that Annie decides that she could not go back as a widow to Dobo, definitely, because a number of those men who'd been caught in the Kaum Merah uprising had been executed, and she feared for her life. It also appears that she informed on the more radical elements within the Indonesian community in Melbourne to Dutch intelligence. And so she did not believe that she was safe, nor that it would be a life for her children. Before Jacob returns to Merauke, where he was going to be based, he asks his neighbour and landlord, John O'Keefe, that if anything should happen to him, he knew how dangerous it was, and he said, if anything happens to me, would you please look after my family? And John O'Keefe decides to do this by marrying Annie, and they do have an extra child themselves together. But the Australian government is suspicious this is a marriage of convenience, which at first it probably was, and say no, she will have to go back anyway. And that is the basis of the High Court action that takes place, and that's where Sean Brawley will take up the story as I've completed the prequel.
What happens?
What happens? She wins the case. And this is a milestone in terms of the White Australia policy in Australia. It had never been taken to the High Court before, and so it's really a major achievement in terms of the people who supported Annie, and also I think the dedication of her new husband, John O'Keefe.
Are the children? The children?
Sorry, the children? Now the children split, so some of them stayed in Australia and some of them went back to Indonesia. One of them never came to Australia anyway. He ended up in Sulawesi, in northern Sulawesi. Now Sean Brawley did interview one of the children in the 1990s. Many of them said they just could not, they had no memory much of their father, And of course, as far as what their father was doing was top secret. So they just knew he worked for the Dutch. But there were snippets of information, and I really hope that I will be able to contact them again. They have participated before in some oral histories as well.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was fascinating. Thanks so much. People in the borderline, in a very confusing time, always give you very fascinating stories. Thank you so much for that. So I would like now to invite any comments or questions from you. You can collect maybe two.
Could you move to the next slide, just to end up, just go to the... And keep going. And keep going. There's the mission, and keep going to the next one. That's the cemetery, by the way, where he's buried. And one more slide. And there's John O'Keefe with the family. And of course it was big news. It was on papers both in the Netherlands and in Australia about this High Court case.
Yes. Thank you. Any comments or questions? Yes. 1, 2. Start with you.
I've got a big voice. I'm from the Indonesian Museum of Arts. Did you see our exhibition a couple of years ago?
Yeah.
It was called Near Neighbours, Close Friends, and we had
Yeah.
quite a large segment
Yes.
on Annie O'Keefe. And but you know, I don't know if you realise that Melbourne actually was the centre of the Dutch East Indies government in exile. Yeah, that's why there was such a huge number of Indonesians in Melbourne. There were also Indonesians in Sydney, Mackay, Brisbane, and you know, this was an important time. And the fact that Annie won her case, but there was a comment that we came across. The Archbishop of Melbourne, Mannix, at that time said, a good Catholic family, you know, and Annie in fact was Methodist.
Yes, yes, but her children converted to Catholicism after the marriage.
Yeah, well, I mean, and Mr. O'Keefe was
Definitely Irish, yes.
so, but it's a fascinating story. I'm sorry you didn't see our exhibition because we expanded on a lot that you said. We didn't concentrate much on Samuel Jacob because, well, it was the White Australia policy that I particularly was interested in. But thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
So you mentioned Julius Tahija in one of those slides, and I was just checking into whether you know the book that was written by his wife, Jean, an extraordinary woman.
No, I didn't know about the book by his wife. I know that there's been quite a bit written about him because he, if he's
His wife was a dentist, an Australian woman from Melbourne, and went to live in Jakarta.
Mm.
And it's quite an interesting story.
Well, I would have loved to know the relationship between the two men in particular, one coming from the military and the other coming from the civil service side. But it's been very difficult to find information regarding attitudes towards each other. So you've got to infer, their points of view a lot of the time.
Did Barbara wish you in? Did you?
Well, I was wondering whether this is part of a
Wait,
larger...
Barbara.
Whether this interest in Samuel Jacobs is part of a larger project. I mean, are you now, thinking about other historical characters? I mean, some of them come up in your story of Talking North about people that you've, I guess, discovered, because certainly I didn't know about the wife of the Governor of South Australia, who was very keen on promoting Eastern as well as European languages. So, is it part of a broader project, the Samuel Jacobs stories? Have you got others in mind or coming along?
Well, early in the presentation I showed you those that previous publication of 3 interpreter translators who had worked across different historical periods in regards to the trepang industry. And I was interested to, so it is connected to that project in some ways, but I was looking at a period of war and conflict, as to, again, focusing on particular people, biographic view of individuals who were critical in facilitating communication, given my interest in language. That yes, so none of these people, of course, are ever translators and interpreters by profession. It just becomes one of the crucial links as to why they're thrust into these positions with often quite notable historical figures or more well-known historical figures. So the short answer to your question, yes, I'm interested particularly to follow up this idea of propaganda and individuals who worked to communicate what the Allies wanted to do during the Second World War.
Yes. So
Sorry. Just on his name, have you any idea why he has a Western name?
Samuel,
Yeah.
Jacob, as he probably was pronounced, but by Australians, Jacob. One, because he's Christian, and so many in Eastern Indonesia adopted Christian names. The story behind why those other figures had Christian-sounding names is probably a little more extended, but we can talk about that another time.
Yeah, thanks.
But many people, there was another Jacob, I went down, really a rabbit hole with this other Jacob who was working out of he was at the same time working out of Merauke, working with Australian and Indonesian troops. And I'm going, it's Jacob, yeah? But then it was after his death, so I gathered it was another Jacob. I was just trying to... So there were definitely a lot more than just one.
I was just wondering if Barbara knew that the first Ludruk was also performed in Melbourne by this group of people. I don't know if you know that. April 1943.
That's the Rumah Indonesia. They performed at the Metropole. Yeah.
Any other comments or questions before we close? No? Okay, in that case, did I miss anyone?
No, just
Sorry?
so the next thing should do to Barbara. Sorry.
Yes, of course. So, with that, can I invite you now to thank Paul once again for his great... Now we come to the next part of the meeting, and that is the launch of the preview. Can I invite Barbara to take over?
Yes, and could the authors of the books also come out?
come here, please, Barbara.
And Linda as well, Linda.
Barbara, come here. We need all this.
Yeah.
Go to here. Please take it.
I actually thought time was shorter than it seems to have become more comfortable.
Yes, I got various messages.
But so I haven't prepared anything, any links, but I first of all just want to say how delighted I am to have this opportunity to celebrate the publications of two former colleagues from Monash, whose books would seem to be very different. Paul's edited book with so much information about the teaching of Indonesian language, and before that his own stories, historical accounts, stories, they're factual accounts of interactions between Australians and Indonesians and the role of language, of Indonesian language, and the learning of Indonesian language by Australians in facilitating that relationship, and then the contributions of other people who talk about the history of Indonesian language teaching at different institutions. Charles Koppel, I was hoping he might be here with his long chapter about the program at the University of Melbourne. But Michael Ewing's here, and he tells me he had quite a bit of input into that chapter. So a lot of detailed and factual information in a big edited book. And then there's Stuart's smaller book about a very individual encounter with a mysterious presence of Sri. So Paul's book looks like the big story, and this was a very special individual encounter. But there are connections, because Stuart has a contribution in the Paul's book, talking about the I've got one too in there, and so there's a range of people, and Michael's made a contribution into Charles's chapter, and also there's the stories of individual people are there that were participants in this process of Indonesian language teaching and learning, and their stories are in the book, including that of Stuart. And there's only a little sentence there, but you talk about how the picture of old Java was very attractive. It was Van Neersen who was warbling on about, was it the palmy days of Majapahit?
That was a
Little joke. But that got Stuart intrigued, and off he went to learn all about old Java, and this is the latest current outcome of that passion. So the connections are there between the two books, and I suppose you'd also say my contribution there is a little bit about what really got me interested in Indonesia. So the personal stories are there in Paul's book, and we could say this therefore is a kind of, this event is a celebration of your two books and a wider celebration of that whole process of Indonesian language learning and the journeys that it took people on. Now, Paul has called this event a preview, not a launch. And that's because the official launch is coming up in November at the Indonesian Council Conference at ANU, which is great. I said to Paul, other people I know have launches all over the place. You don't have to have just one launch, but he's he feels a responsibility to ANU to call that the launch. So this is
we'll have another one in Melbourne. We want another one.
Oh, you are going to have one?
Yeah, I want another one.
Okay. But on this occasion, it's a case we get to welcome the publication of Paul's book, which has been long anticipated. It's taken a while in the gestation, and we can buy copies, which will be available at the back there for you to buy, to find out all these interesting things about the process of development of Indonesian language teaching and learning, and its role in bringing the relationship together, and the different phases it's gone through because of Australia's idea of its own identity, and whether we're still seeing things through British and European eyes, or whether we have an independent identity that relates to our geographical position. All of those factors coming into it and part of this book. Now, I wanted Paul to have a little talk here about how, in more detail, about how the book came about, how it all happened. And he said, he'd be prepared to heckle me if I had a go. So perhaps I should start and say as much as I know, and then perhaps he can add a bit. That I understand it started in 2007 at a conference of ASAL with the Australian Society of Indonesian Language Educators, and it was in that 2007 was approximately 50 years after the beginning of the modern phase of Indonesian language teaching. As Paul explains in his chapters in the book, there was various efforts and smaller enterprises, but the big push to have Indonesian taught in universities and so on started from the 50s and 60s onwards. And Paul was talking about the process of Indonesian, the teaching, learning, the contact between Australia and Indonesia through language at giving a conference paper. And it only got up to about 1862, and he saw Philip Mencken's eyes glazing over, and it was time to stop. So he thought, well, he'd perhaps better stop there, but maybe...
Oh no, I made it to the 1870s.
Oh, right, okay. But was that true? That was the germ of the idea. Here's a much bigger project that could bring in different facets and different people to contribute their chapters.
If I can just add, I mean, the idea was that I was going to present a little bit about the beginnings of the modern Indonesian program, because it was the 50th anniversary. So I assumed that this was going to be a relatively short history, and I put together a few words, and then I just got carried away in the archives discovering all this extra information, and that is why I only got to the 1870s by the time my 20 minutes was up.
Yes, and that is a fascinating story about all that early stuff, which is there in the book in Paul's chapter. Paul has 2 chapters. One is that goes back to the Tripangers and the interpreters who worked in the Malay towns, the towns in northern Australia, when there was an idea that we were going to develop northern Australia as a sort of outward-looking outpost, and it would relate to the north, and there were, as you say, people who were accidentally there who had capacity to be interpreters and so on. But I don't know if you want to say any more about that part of the story. And then into Paul's second chapter there is about the Menzies years and about the start of the idea that we needed to relate to Indonesia, and I was fascinated by Menzies going to Batavia and giving a speech, and the effort that everybody had to make to try and get him to pronounce it properly.
Well, yeah, he could pronounce Indonesian. I have got a recording, and his pronunciation of Indonesian is not unlike my pronunciation of Dutch. So that'll give you an idea.
But in order to take the story more widely, Paul invited people to talk about different aspects and different locations. So there are, as I've mentioned before, there's quite a long chapter and quite a critical one too by the people from University of Melbourne, or the critical of the way the administration changed its mind about what they wanted to do, about the ups and downs and so on. And then I guess it's a pretty good news story about the Melbourne program at the end with the Melbourne model and getting students into the program in that way. But there's also chapters about Indonesian teaching materials and how they've grown and developed. And there's a chapter by David Hill about his reports on the teaching in recent years and the big decline in the new century, the 21st century, after the political events of the Bali bombings and the change of government from the Keating era to the present Liberal government and so on. But a good news story about in-country language, that's a way of more Australians learning Indonesian. So this is a big picture story with chapters about various events. That's the first part of the book. And then the second part is smaller personal accounts, like Stuart's about the program in Sydney. Paul, are there really some highlights you'd want to mention? Or things that...
Look, I'm wiped up anyway.
Yeah.
Look, the only thing, I really think we need to move on to Stuart's story here with his book, but the only thing I'd add is, it was a very long time to bring this group of people together. I didn't realise how many academics I would be dealing with and all their difficulties and things that occurred during the research for the book. And sadly, one of the major contributors passed away, Pak Haru, and I dedicated part of the book to Pak Haru and to his family. So there was, it wasn't that easy to bring together all these people, but in the end we did it. There were criticisms in the early stage. For example, when I was giving one presentation at the Open Conference, which we hosted at Caulfield, I had this terrible time where my slides, pictures randomly were disappearing, and I got more flustered, I think, than I'd ever been in a presentation. You would just put a slide up, and sometimes the picture would be there, sometimes it wouldn't be there, and sometimes the notes would be, and so people didn't understand what was going on. But it was something to do with an incompatible version of PowerPoint that I was using at the time. But at the end of that, there was this criticism saying, look, you've not mentioned any of the women involved. And I said, well, they were all men, they were all men. And because I only was dealing up to the 1950s when Menzies introduces the program and all the people. But of course, it just shows you how ignorant. Eventually, as you research, you find that you're bound to find that women are always going to be in that history. And sure enough, people I just never dreamt of discovering, like the wife of the Governor of South Australia in the early 20th century, has quite a passionate interest in languages, including Eastern languages, as she would call them, and she goes on a campaign that the universities should be teaching languages. She holds public, not quite rallies, but public talks in Adelaide Town Hall and Melbourne Town Hall, and everyone turns out because it's the Governor of South Australia, so they all turn out. So she's a great campaigner and quite an interesting character when
What's
it comes.
her name?
I knew you would ask me that. It's
Galway, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Galway. Yeah, I've got it. Winifred Ponder, who I do remember straight away, was another interesting character. She was specifically interested in the promotion of Malay and many other Eastern languages, but she spoke Malay. This is now moving to the period in the 1930s. Highly critical of the government, who would send trade missions into Indonesia or the Netherlands, East Indies to do trade, but without any language skills. So she herself toured in the Netherlands, East Indies. She would take off with her automobile in Java and drive the length of it. She was based in Queensland, and again, I think for me she's a particularly interesting character and deserves some more stories and some more interest. But it just shows you there's so much hidden history, and again, the assumptions that you make when you start a research project can be quite limiting. But it was a very enjoyable process trying to bring some of these people back to the spotlight.
Okay, that maybe sounds like a good high point to end. So we'll declare your book, if not launched, celebrated and warmly welcomed.
Yes.
Move on to Stuart's book. So Linda's going to tell us, as the publisher of the book, about how she came to know about the book and the story of its publication, and then on to Stuart to talk about how Sri came to him.
Okay, first of all, thanks Barbara, and I'm very honoured to be able to not only publish this book but to put it together for Stuart. Just a little bit of background. I first met Stuart when I went back to Monash many years ago and did Javanese and Indonesian, advanced Indonesian, and also when I was a teaching fellow there in 1997. We remained in touch, and I think we had quite a few emails about our publisher that we were both working for at the time, Tuttle, who are an offset of Periplus. Stuart was doing very different books to myself. And then in my inbox one day was this little note that said, I've just put together this story and I'd like to know what you think. And I opened it up not knowing what I was going to read. And it was this most delightful story. And it wasn't just a little story, it was a long story. And to me it had the most poetic writing style. And it also entwined Stuart's in-depth understanding of the Javanese language throughout it. Oh, am I not speaking loud enough? Do I need it?
Yes, please.
Okay, sorry about that. I decided to surprise Stuart and put together one copy of the book, just as a fun thing to do. And Stuart was quite impressed with that, and I said, oh, you should get it published one day. But he had approached a publisher, hadn't you? But several. But hadn't got very good feedback, and publishers don't want small audiences, so that kind of died. And then the years went by, and I pushed him again and said, you should really get it published. And then I said, would you like me to publish it? And he said yes. So that's basically how it came to be into the book it is today. And in the end, it's a beautiful book. You can see it's got a beautiful cover, and it's a beautiful story for those of you who've read it. Sorry, I'm not speaking into the microphone. And you do not have to understand any Javanese in order to appreciate the story. There's lots of little translations and footnotes, as Stuart's very good at doing.
That's good,
And to me, I really felt it was the Java that I had known way back in the 70s, but also this is a story in more modern times, but it's actually timeless. It could be any time. And it describes the Java that we all know. Who is Sri? How did Stuart come to translate her story? I'll leave that to you to tell.
Thank you. Yes, the story goes back to December 2008, when I was at home alone because the family had gone to stay in Bangkok for a few months. And then something very strange happened. In the middle of the night, I was visited by Sri, and she wanted to tell her story. And in the morning, I got straight up and started typing. This happened night after night. I was just completely carried away, almost possessed. Strange thing. So when I'd brought the story to a conclusion, that's when I produced a few copies, like the one that Linda got, and a few other people, like Jacinta. Jacinta said it made me cry. So maybe I thought, look, maybe it is effective after all. So, what sort of story is this? The title says it already. It's a Javanese girl speaking in the first person. She's talking about her experiences in her early life. She's recalling what happened in her past, and the description of the scenes is exactly as she saw them, the people that she knew. The scenes are not imaginary. There's a description of her mother's kitchen, for example. There really were two aniani, rice harvesting knives, poked into the weave of the bamboo walls. There really was a stove on the floor, with the smoke coming up through the tiles. I could almost smell that slightly pungent smell of wood smoke. The kitchen door had a bar across it, which was tight. If you got up early in the morning, you had to push it across. Clack! That's the kind of noise it made. And out in the backyard, there really was a pigungan, a place for buffalo tethering. And there really were buffaloes there. There was a baby buffalo there. When Sri went past there, the buffalo put up his head in the early morning dawn and said, "Meh," which is Javanese for almost. Symbolic, because Sri almost fell into the trap. She was making her escape at that point. And a bit further up the road, there really was a squashed lizard on the road, symbolic of what would have happened to her if she'd stayed at home. Well, there are many more details like that. However, if you go back to Paperingan now, you will not find the house, because some years ago the woodwork, the bamboo, started to rot. So people decided that it had to be pulled apart. Otherwise it might, under the weight of the tiles, it might have fallen down. So that's gone. Instead, there's just an empty space there now, with a couple of pineapple plants. You would never think that a family had been brought up there, had lived there, just empty. And yet, paradoxically, there is also continuity, because the rambutan tree that Sri planted out in the front, on the southern side that is still growing, and has grown up big, and still bearing fruit. So some things change, and some things don't. It's paradoxical, isn't it? The story is not just descriptive, it's about social relations as well. The members of the family and other people and their interactions. From what Sri says, you can get a clear picture of how they interacted with each other. There was her father bullying her downtrodden mother. Then, of course, there was uncle and aunt, and Master Atmore and her uncle Hadi, with his special interest in history and literature. So these people are real too, no less than the landscape that they inhabit. John Knott really was as ugly as he says, and Master Atmore really was as regal and handsome as he describes. And with his little moustache, just here, he called it Lard Main Chop. The pertine fly. That was his little joke.
She brought him too, did she, when she came to visit you?
No. Long before that. Yeah. Some of the descriptions he makes are remarkably poetical, reflecting the situation. Like on page 9, just quote if I may, "The distant roar of a Garuda flight, full throttle on its way westward to Jakarta, already high up in the clouds, the sound rising and falling like thunder." I got quite emotional. You actually heard that, sitting quietly at home. They're on their way. Maybe that's what gave Sri the idea that he should leave on a particular day. People making their way to avoiding an unescapable fate. And passing the graveyard also symbolises an ending, which was to be followed by a new beginning. One more little quote, if I may, before I end, just to illustrate the poetic quality of some of what she says. I'll just try to grab this. On page 26, when Sri has to move to Semarang to follow her training, the city of Semarang shimmered in the heat. The sky was a sheet of glare that merged with a leaden sea. The streets were full of noise, the mind-numbing noise of a million motorcycles, and I didn't know the way. Loneliness is the greatest enemy of all, an insidious enemy, an enemy that undermines the spirit, erodes resolve, and saps the strength. Now you can see her thinking developing stage by stage through the story, as marked by little refrains as she moves from being an uneducated village girl to getting a training, getting a diploma, and in the end forms her own family. So the underlying message through the whole is that of development. She thinks for herself. She works hard, is persistent, and succeeds. Of course, also with the important help of her uncle and aunt. Without them, she would not have made it. So I hope that you'll read the story right through, from beginning to end, without stopping. It's a bit like a lakon or a gamelan melody. You can't stop it halfway. You should read right through. It's short enough to read in one sitting, I think. There's even little gunungan's been put into the book that symbolise this idea of a lakon going from the beginning right through to the end. And the picture on the front is a portrait that Linda found, but uncannily it looks just like Sri when she was young. It's an amazing thing. Now,
And I have to admit, I did cut her hair.
fair enough. So, with many thanks to Linda for her excellent work here, much appreciated, to Barbara for her encouragement and support, and Jacinta for her backup. Thanks to those. And now, I think